Hi and welcome. I'm Ed O'Keefe, the senior White House and political correspondent for CBS News. I'm in Washington tonight. Great to be with you. And we're here for a first of its kind conversation between myself and three CBS reporters at stations in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Sacramento as California gets ready for the recall election, which is scheduled for Tuesday. And as if they needed more attention in that state to what's become a really high stakes political contest, President Biden himself flew in on Monday to spend some time with Governor Newsom and campaign on his behalf with just hours to go until polls open and those ballots have to be in the mail. The president spent time essentially making a 3-point pitch on behalf of the governor, arguing that he's the kind of responsible leader that's needed during a pandemic and that handing things over to a Republican could be too risky for the nation's largest state. Also made the argument that on the concerning and urgent issue of climate change, the governor, more than many other state leaders across the country, has a firm grasp on it based on his management of the state's historic wildfires this year. And then is also making a more recent argument, or an argument that's grown out of something that's happened more recently, and that is that restrictive abortion law that was passed in Texas recently that Democrats across the country has seized on, going to argue that essentially handing the state over to a Republican instead of Governor Newsom could be risky for women in that state. So a sort of classic series of Democratic Party arguments on behalf of one of the Democratic Party's biggest stars. And the governor over the last several weeks, you may know, has been helped not only by the current president, but the current vice president, Kamala Harris, his old friend and colleague from the Bay Area. Former President Barack Obama is airing a television ad that many Californians have seen on repeat, essentially, for the last several days. And the governor was joined by two of the party's other big stars, Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, because his entire party understands if things go wrong for them in the nation's largest Democratic state, then things could go really wrong for them next year in midterm elections across the country. Now, will it be enough? Well, recent polling suggests that a majority of Californians are opposed to recalling the governor or opposed to removing him from office. It's kind of a tricky calculation that voters have to do. Democrats are asking people to vote no. Those in support of the recall, predominantly Republicans, are asking them to vote yes. But majority, based on recent polls, are now increasingly against the recall and, in essence, keeping the governor. For the uninitiated, either in or outside of California, and if you're confused by this, it's totally understandable because it doesn't happen every so often, but it's a 2-question ballot. And every eligible voter in California has been mailed a ballot, or they can show up to vote on recall day in person at a local voting site. They got 2 questions to answer. First one asks, should Governor Newsom be recalled and essentially removed from office? If you vote no, you don't really have to worry about question 2, which is, if you want to remove him, who on this list of 45 candidates would you suggest should be governor? And whoever comes out on top there, if a majority of people vote yes on the recall, would become the next governor of California. It's possible that somebody that wins only 25% of that vote, a minority of the overall vote, could become governor of California. But again, polling suggests that may or may not happen. So we're going to get into a conversation about this now with 3 reporters who've been covering this far more closely than me. I cover politics at the national level. We dive into issues of concern in states all across the country, cover the White House as well. But these guys have been in the thick of it over the last several weeks, several months, as the recall campaign began, has picked up steam, and now is on the verge of a decision. So I'm glad to be with Tom Waite tonight of KCBS. He's in Sacramento, preparing for coverage tomorrow night on behalf of CBS 2 and KCAL 9 up in Sacramento. And then we have Steve Large of KOVR CBS 13 in Sacramento as well. We will be joined a little later by our buddy Kenny Choi of KPIX, CBS 5 in San Francisco. Given that it is 6 o'clock in the West, he's actually on the news on broadcast television. So when he's done with that, he'll come over here and join us on the internet. Guys, thank you so much for doing this tonight. We're really excited about this partnership between the CBS News at the national level and our buddies who work at the local level as we prepare for some really interesting coverage on Tuesday night across your stations and across CBSN at the national level. Let's just start with sort of the basics of what's been happening in your neck of the woods over the last 24 hours with just a few hours to go. What are you hearing from voters, and what are the candidates saying here in their final moments of trying to convince people to vote one way or the other. Tom, why don't we start with you?
Well, as you mentioned, we are here in Sacramento, which, of course, is where the president was just a little while ago. A few hours ago, he landed here. He met with Governor Newsom, and he talked a lot about the topics you were talking about, so climate change, particularly about the wildfire issues here in Northern and Southern California. And then Mr. Biden goes down south to talk with the folks in Southern California. In Long Beach, of course, the governor using all of this time with the president to promote the message that you should vote no on the recall. The governor, as you talked about, Ed, I think it's an interesting situation. It makes this even more confusing, is when you get this, you get to vote on this, yes or no. You can vote no, but you can still pick a replacement. So it's sort of counterintuitive, because you think that if you vote no, that maybe then you would not pick someone to replace the governor, since you're voting to, keep him. But you can actually vote to pick somebody else. Well, of course, the governor is using every opportunity he can to just say, vote no, don't pick anyone else. The Democratic Party here in California didn't pick anybody to put on that replacement list. They're going all in with the governor. So, and obviously some heavy hitters have been coming here for the Democratic Party. Kamala Harris, as you mentioned, was here. Elizabeth Warren was also here, senator from Massachusetts. So I think that the Democrats are trying to bring out all their star power to help. And of course, the president being here in Northern and Southern California is a big deal. It's something that Governor Newsom is absolutely banking on to help carry him over the finish line.
Steve, it's not every day a president comes to Sacramento. Usually when they come to California, they're going to San Francisco or LA or San Diego to raise money.
So, yeah. And, one of the things about California and about this election is I think it's kind of crazy, really, for people outside of the state to hear this, but the Republican Party is almost a third party in California. There are so many more Democrats. There's 2-to-1 ratio of Democrats to Republicans. And if you add up the undeclareds and all the independent parties, the Green parties and whatnot, that number is actually greater than the number of Republican Party members, registered Republicans in the state of California. So the big question was going to be a math question, was the turnout. Will people end up showing up to the polls? Because if they do, just the math itself would favor a Newsom victory in this race. And that was the question. It was a guessing game. But because of early voting, we're kind of getting now, even before this final election day, a really good sense of how it's turning out. And right now, according to the numbers, we're seeing 38% of people, registered voters, have in fact turned their ballots in, which is a pretty good sign that the turnout is going to be really significant. In fact, right now, just 2 days, the latest numbers, 2 days ahead of the final election day, more Californians have cast their ballots for this recall election than cast their ballots in the 2018 gubernatorial election that put Newsom into office.
So that suggests not only really big interest among Newsom's fellow Democrats, but also independents and potentially a big chunk of Republicans. But something has clearly broken through here to convince Democrats to show up and vote, when just a few weeks ago, there was a suggestion that the enthusiasm really was among Republicans or others who just didn't like the governor, and not as much among Democrats. What did he do? And this is for either of you. And the answer may be as simple as TV advertising. You tell me. But
well, Steve,
what has he done to convince people to cast that ballot?
I just spoke with a political analyst in Southern California, Jessica Levinson, and she kind of broke this down. And I think it actually makes a lot of sense. She said initially the problem for the recall for Newsom was that he didn't have any sort of face to put on it. Well, now he does. The front runner in this election is a very conservative radio talk show host, Larry Elder, the front runner on the replacement candidates, I should say. And he's a Trump supporter, and he shares a lot of the views of the former president. And so Gavin Newsom has now been able to sort of put a face on the recall, and he thinks that by saying, look, if you get rid of me, this is who you most likely would get as a replacement. And I think that's galvanized a lot of Democrats. And as Steve and I were just talking about too before we got started, a man named Paul Mitchell helps to run a group called Political Data, a company that gathers and analyzes political data. And it turns out, as you said, Ed, Democrats right now have a much, I believe it's about 50% in terms of the returns on the vote totals that have come in so far. We don't know for sure what they voted, but Democrats, I think, account for more than 50% of the ballots that have been returned. And I believe that the Republicans are in the mid-20s somewhere. So that, as you said, that does bode well for Democrats. And I think, based on the analysis we're hearing, it's because now Gavin Newsom can say, okay, you want to get rid of me? Well, here's who you can pick. And I think that in some ways that scares Democrats enough to fill out a ballot. It's very easy to do. You don't have to go to a polling place. And that really makes a lot of sense for people.
And just to reiterate, I had the opportunity to talk to, there's only been one other California governor that's ever been recalled before. That was Gray Davis back in 2003. Arnold Schwarzenegger ended up winning that recall election. And I had the opportunity to talk to Gray Davis's former spokesperson, Steve Maviglio, who called Larry Elder's basically becoming the main face of the recall campaign as a Christmas present, because just as Tom was saying, it really does put a face on what the head of the state government would look like if Newsom is recalled. And it's basically looks very similar to the Trump presidency, which, in California is something that's the 2-to-1 ratio of Democrats to Republicans. Just is a scary idea.
And you have broad support across the state for the mask and vaccine mandates, right? So when you have this guy emerge as the leading alternative, saying
one of the things that he said is that one of the first, I believe he put it before he had a cup of tea, he said last Sunday he would repeal the mask mandates. So
at least for state employees or something. But
yeah, so that's the kind of language that he's using, and that's the kind of, his base likes to hear that. He spoke to an evangelical church when he said that, a church that has been handing out religious exemptions for mask mandates. He was speaking to the choir literally there, but of course his words were heard all across the state.
Sure. So, definition of a good street reporter is one that works in his car. And that would be Choi, who joins us now from San Francisco. Joined in late because he was doing his actual day job, reporting for the 6 p.m. news there on KPIX in the Bay Area.
Yeah, absolutely.
What did you share with the viewers? What can you tell us, Kenny, as we tick down the final hours?
Ed, thanks for having me here today. It's great to be with all of you. You're talking about Larry Elder, how he has emerged as the leading candidate midway through the summer. And so for the Newsom campaign, I think they were able to really use that to their advantage. They felt like the picture became a lot clearer, and they were able to make sure that the voters knew who they were voting for. I think prior to Elder coming into this election, it was really, there was this recall effort against Newsom. I think a lot of voters, first of all, weren't even aware of it. The Newsom campaign and the advisors were talking about how they were so concerned about voter apathy until you reached that point in the summer where you had Elder emerging as a candidate. And a lot of his statements that had come out from the past, those were emerging. And so people were able to kind of really see what that choice would be, Newsom or Elder. And I think his campaign really tried to take advantage of that by framing this as a choice, a life or death choice, as you've heard in some of the ads.
I want to mention, by the way, if you're watching us on Facebook or on Twitter, you can, of course, join the conversation by typing in your thoughts. More importantly, typing in a question if you have one. And we'll try to call it out here and have these guys answer it. We're with Kenny Choi of KPIX in San Francisco, Tom White of KCBS in Los Angeles, who tonight is in Sacramento getting ready for tomorrow, and Steve Large also in Sacramento with KOVR. All three stations preparing for special wall-to-wall coverage on their CBSN channels tomorrow night and throughout the day on their regularly scheduled newscasts. I'm in DC. Myself and a handful of our CBS News colleagues will be joining their coverage throughout the night tomorrow night, most especially Anthony Salvanto, our director of elections and polling, who will be crunching the numbers and showing viewers in real time where it is that the governor or Larry Elder or somebody else may be prevailing in the count. Guys, there are 45 other there's Gavin Newsom, and there's 45 other candidates running. As I think Steve mentioned, maybe it was Tom, no other Democrat got on the ballot. Newsom successfully convincing his fellow Democrats, stay out of this. Let me take them on. That was a big problem for Gray Davis back in 2003, and that there were a handful of Democrats who got in and confused things for him, proved that he was weak, and he ends up losing to Schwarzenegger. Newsom doesn't have that problem. But when this thing began, for those of us on the outside looking in, this was a race that was going to be won by Caitlyn Jenner, the Olympian and reality TV star who jumped out ahead and very quickly earned a lot of attention because she had interest in the race and very quickly sort of cast herself as a potential alternative to the governor. But she faded so quickly. And you've got John Cox, the guy who ran against Newsom back in 2018. How did Larry Elder get to the top suddenly? I don't know whoever wants to take that, but because I know a few of you.
Well, I think it's surprising that, if I could just jump in, that I think people initially, when this, back in April, just when it qualified, people were anticipating that there would be hundreds, if not thousands of candidates to join, because it's really cheap. All you have to do is pay maybe a couple $100 to get on the ballot. So that is a good question. And I think it's worth emphasizing your point about no other Democrats being on the ballot. And that is something that, the governor's campaign really framed it and branded this as a Republican recall, even when it wasn't clear that it was. I mean, back in the early part of the year, it wasn't really that clear that this was a Republican-led recall. You had all these moms across the board upset that their kids were not getting the education that they wanted them to have because of the lockdown of schools, and we call them mad moms. And so his ability to keep all of the pouncing of other politically motivated Democrats off of that ballot is the win already for his campaign. If you can just imagine, Antonio Villaraigosa, former mayor of LA, or Kevin De Leon, former Senate Pro Tem of California, jumping in, that really creates a murky message. But why another prominent Republican name didn't jump into this California race, it's probably because there just really aren't any other prominent Republican names in California.
Tom, I know you talked to Elder. How did he end up on top?
Well, before we get to that, I just wanted to add one quick thing so we don't, because I think we'll get bounced on. When we say there are no Democrats in this, we just mean that there are no California Democratic Party approved Democrats. There are, I think, 9 Democrats on the list, one of whom actually is sort of polling fairly well. I think he polls in some cases right behind Larry Elder. His name is Kevin Paffrath. He's a YouTube personality, has millions of views on his videos. He offers investment and real estate advice. So he's Democrat. He's a self-identified Democrat. But as you said, I
will take the audible on that, and knowing that we're on YouTube, we're going to get spanked by those.
Yeah, I just know there's probably like computers exploding with it. Like, no Democrats. But yeah, well, Larry Elder, he has a deep history, and he's from Los Angeles. He has, a lot of support down there. He's very well known. He's had a show on for years, various stations and online. I mean, so he has a very loyal fan base, and so it was already baked in, I think, when he decided to launch his bid for governor. And I think that fan base is so intense there. It's almost very Trump-esque in the following. People are very loyal to him, and they've known him for years. They feel like they know him, and so when he launched his campaign, I think that he started with a nice base of support.
Yeah. I got a geography question for each of you, a specific one. And let me start with you, Tom, because it starts there. Why would it make sense for the president and Newsom to go to Long Beach tonight? Why Southern California, and why that specific part of the state? Is there any reason behind that you're aware of?
Well, I can't be certain, but I can say that we do know that turnout among Latinos in California has not been very strong. And there is a large community of Latinos in Long Beach. The mayor of Long Beach is a Latino. And I think that may have something to do with it. I think, President Biden comes to California as sort of the closer, because obviously the election, as we've been talking about, has been going on now for a few weeks. with the mail-in ballots. We can either walk them in, mail them in. You can vote in person already right now. There's voting stations open. So I think this just acts as kind of, he started in Northern California, finishes in Southern, where, obviously they want to get as many ballots in as they can.
That's right. Robert Garcia, the mayor of Long Beach, a rising star who many think might run for governor himself one day, or Senate, or something else. Kenny, to you in the Bay Area, the vice president went back to Oakland, went home for the governor, what was it, last week, about 10 days ago. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were campaigning with him as well. First, does Harris have the ability to bring out people in Oakland and across the Bay Area that would help him? And have you met a voter who has told you, gosh, just because Bernie Sanders came to California, I got to go vote for Governor Newsom because he convinced me that I should do this?
To answer your second question, no, I haven't met that voter yet, but it certainly is possible. When you talk about Vice President Harris visiting Oakland, she is Bay Area born and bred. So many of the female voters that I spoke to on that day in San Leandro, when they held that rally, they were so excited to see her. So anytime a person like Governor Gavin Newsom, when he's trying to drum up support and he's trying to get out that message to vote, you're going to want those heavy hitters to come. And so when Harris was there, it certainly gave him a boost. It doesn't hurt. And so for him, it makes sense for the Newsom campaign. It makes sense to bring out as many people as they can to show the Democratic Party that they are unified. That's the difference you're seeing in 2021 versus 2003 when Gray Davis was ousted. The Democratic Party did not have that unity that they are showing now, with all these players coming in, backing up Newsom, including President Biden, Harris, and you've got the senators, Amy Klobuchar, Bernie Sanders, and the list goes on, as well as all the state Democratic leaders. We've seen that movie play out. We don't want that to happen again in 2021.
And of course, Newsom and the vice president go back to San Francisco City Hall, right, where he was district attorney, he was mayor, and they were kind of going like this, like who's gonna get ahead of the other one in statewide politics. And here we are, where he's having quite a moment, and she, of course, has gone off to Washington to become vice president. So for them, it's kind of a reunion of old buddies who've worked together for a while. Steve, you were reminding us earlier, of course, Sacramento, a little more inland. And your market, probably the most politically diverse of the three, in that you've got a lot more Republican pro-recall voters up in that part of the state. And as you also rightly pointed out, people outside the state often forget it may be overwhelmingly Democratic, but there are a lot of Republicans.
There are. I mean, this is it's a huge state. And so it is, we speak a lot of times in broad strokes, but the fact of the matter is that there is a lot of outrage against the way Governor Newsom has handled the pandemic, the policies he's put in place that a lot of business owners feel were just simply unfair. So, I work in the Sacramento market, which, goes as far north as, Colusa County, as far south as Stanislaus County. There's a lot of ag land that goes as far east as Lake Tahoe, and we cover some of the inland Bay Area as well. So you can literally drive a half an hour out of Sacramento, and you can be in the heartland of Trump country, and that's what we see. So we do see a lot of energy, and that energy that people were talking about that was going to make the difference in this race early on, that there wasn't enough energy on the Democratic side, but there was enough on the Republican side. You could really feel that when you went out and you did stories, because you could feel the outrage, and that's really still exists. But here in the last month, what we're seeing in this early voting is that it doesn't take a whole lot of energy to turn in those ballots, and Democrats have, whether they're either upset at what they're seeing happening in Texas or they are pleased that their kids are back in school, Democrats have enough energy to get out the votes right now in this early voting.
And we should remind people, every eligible voter in the state says was sent a ballot. There will be questions about whether it arrived at the right address, whether multiple ballots were sent. Some Republicans have already started raising questions about that. But either way, to have a system that sends tens of millions of ballots out and makes it that easy for voters is part of what's probably driving the response rate here. Is that, if all it takes is putting it right back in the mail. Really,
yeah, I mean, and the pandemic fueled that. I mean,
right.
People, like I mentioned earlier, it's interesting to see. To me, I was surprised to see it that actually there have been a lot more ballots returned in early voting for this recall election than were returned just almost 3 years ago in the 2018 gubernatorial election.
Clearly, the biggest issue has been the pandemic. Who would lead the state through the end of it? Have you guys seen any other issue crop up, either in your area or across the state, that you find interesting, has become a topic of conversation?
I think one thing.
Yeah, go ahead, Tim. Go ahead, Tim.
Oh no, go ahead. Kenny, go ahead. You first.
I was going to say, you could definitely see the candidates trying to take advantage of whatever problems may exist. I'm trying to speak as these alerts are coming through my phone, but when you look at these candidates who have given their stump speech over the last several weeks and have come into the Bay Area, they try to take advantage of what is right there and visible. You see candidates like Caitlyn Jenner, as well as Kevin Faulconer, the former San Diego mayor, coming into San Francisco, wanting to take advantage of what you see in the background. Homelessness in San Francisco, that's been one of those issues that they can pounce on. But you certainly see those candidates trying to take advantage of whatever is visible, some of the visible problems in the cities that they're visiting.
I mean, Kenny's so right about that homeless issue. It's a huge thing in Los Angeles, but there's one other issue, and I don't think it's as front and center as maybe some people would think it should be, but it's the national implications of this race. And that is, if a Republican were to win, and it's very possible, even though the numbers favor the Democrats, these elections are very hard to predict. And tomorrow could be a huge turnout day for Republicans. We know from the 2020 presidential election, the Republicans obviously like to vote on election day. So that's a big, they have a big hill to climb, but who knows what will happen tomorrow? We have to wait and see. But what I was going to say is another major issue here is that we have the oldest sitting senator in Senator Dianne Feinstein. There's been a lot of reporting that Democrats are concerned about her health. Obviously, if she had to retire before the end of her term and a Republican were to take over the governorship, that would mean that the Republican could then nominate a Republican replacer. And then, of course, the Senate being 50-50 then would switch over to Republican control. So that's a major, major side issue that, given how things play out, you just don't know.
Thank you for taking us there, because that was where I was headed next, which is Dianne Feinstein. I mean, here in D.C., the concern in the 50-50 Senate is that one senator catches a head cold or stubs their toe, and things could grind to a halt for a few days if they go missing. So, yes, to have the oldest senator be Dianne Feinstein, and like it or not, folks, there's this long-running concern that, at some point, someone like her could no longer be able to serve for whatever reason. And that is one issue I know outside of California that there's been a lot of concern and intrigue around is, well, what could this mean if she were no longer able to be a senator? So I'm intrigued to hear that it has come up and is enough of a concern to some voters and certainly the Democrats involved that they've made it an issue. Of course, she refuses to say that she's going anywhere. She has a term to play out and has shown no signs of going anywhere, but there have been conversations with her about whether it's time to hang it up or whether she should consider doing so in the next year or so, and allow the governor to appoint yet another statewide official. And that was another thing I was thinking. I got to believe, having just been through the presidential last year, this recall, going into next year, Californians are going to be exhausted of politics if they weren't already, because you got to do this all over again. Newsom would if he wins. I
don't even know if it'll ever even end. I mean, the campaign might just continue to roll along because the governor has created, from what I've heard, quite the infrastructure for his next campaign. He has a lot of money now. He's got a system for small donors as well as big money. And as soon as this recall election is over, I mean, we're looking at the his next election is just next year. So yeah, it's going to be a continuous flow of political advertising, and I don't know that we'll see a break from it at all.
And in California, we'll continue to cover all the other recalls that could take place within the next year, leading up to 2020, 2022.
Well, it's interesting. Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Tom.
I was going to say another interesting fun fact about our recall system here in California is that unlike the other states, I believe there's like 19 of them that have recall laws. And unlike a lot of the other recall elections in California, whether it's a city council person in any given city, the gubernatorial recall trigger in California is relatively low. Only 12% of the people who voted in the previous election, gubernatorial election, are needed in terms of signatures to trigger the recall. Most states, if they have a recall law, it's 25 to 40%. So just think about that. You only need 12% of the people who voted. So that's even a smaller percent of the population, because you have to consider whatever the voter turnout was. And so, and then you can start this process. So there's also talk about, does this need to be reformed?
You guys have a lot of reporters who cover campaigns will have either a data point or a neighborhood or a zip code that they'll look at as like their indicator for how things might break. Have you come up with one that you might be tracking tomorrow for evidence of things breaking one way or the other? Anyone?
For me, again, the what I think is going to end up happening is you're going to have a lot of counties, the rural counties. The message may be lost in this. There's going to be a lot of counties that actually probably support this recall. There's, I believe you guys can correct me. What is it? 58 counties in California, 52, 58. Anyways, so many counties in California. There are a lot of these counties. There's so few people that live in them. We've got a county in our area, Alpine County. I want to say there's like 1,500 people in the entire county. So you're going to see a lot of counties that are going to support this, but the big urban areas, I think, will be the difference maker in this recall election, and it'll be a divided. The division will not end with this election.
So watch those inland red counties and see how strong the support is, especially on election day. Tom, how about you?
Yeah, I think the biggest number that we will be watching will be the voting in person numbers tomorrow. How heavy is traffic? How big is the turnout? Because that's really what's going to have to offset for the Republicans at this point, at least in terms of who has voted so far and who counts for most of the returned ballots. Republicans have to turn it out tomorrow. They have to go in large numbers to make up for where they stand right now, given the way the polls and the returns look and the data that's been examined.
Kenny, anywhere there in the Bay Area?
It's a good question, Ed. And so what I'm just kind of looking at right now is when you see those early returns of those ballots returns by registered Democrats and registered Republicans, you have that buffer of roughly, the last time I checked, it was about 2.2 million. The difference in the number of ballots that have been returned by registered Democrats and registered Republicans. So to Tom's point, the unknown factor at this point is who's going to show up on election day? How many? Are they going to be energized? When you talk about voter apathy, the Newsom campaign has talked about that. But when you look at the rate of returns between registered Democrats and Republicans, it's pretty similar, around 40% or so, or 30 something, high 30s. So the rate of return of registered Democrats and Republicans is similar, but we just don't know who's going to show up on election day. That's the X factor in all of this. And so we'll see if there's going to be enough that show up on election day. Political Data Inc. has been looking at this data and the early returns, and they're talking about how 1.3 million, if that difference between registered Democrats and registered Republicans returning those ballots, if it's roughly around 1.3 million, it's more than enough for Newsom to withhold that lead, or not the lead, but it'll certainly, even if there is a strong red shift on election day, Newsom should be fine.
All right, guys, it's shameless plug time. Tell us how you're covering this, how you and your station are covering this tomorrow, and where folks can sort of keep track of the information, at least in your parts of California. Let's go. We'll start with Steve.
Okay, me. Well, I think that it's interesting. We don't know where Gavin Newsom is going to be yet. I believe he's going to be in Northern California, but it sounds like there's not going to be a big. Of course, we're still in this pandemic era, right? So, not a big watch party for sure, but it's unclear that there will be any event whatsoever from Newsom at this point in time. So, we're on standby to wait for where we might see him pop up sometime after 8 o'clock when those first numbers come in. I'm sure he's going to say something. It's just we don't know how much of a scene he's going to make about it. It's not. I don't think you could call it really a victory speech. It's going to be a weird night for sure.
One place we know he won't be is the French Laundry.
You can assume that.
Yeah, we didn't even
Look
mention
it up.
that. Yeah, but that's where this whole thing took off. I'm sure everyone knows that by now.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, for those that don't, remind them what happened.
Well, okay. So as we talked about before, our recall system here in California, it's been attempted many times. And as I think Steve was saying, and he talked too, it's only worked one time. There's only been one time where a successful recall of the governor is taking place. It was 2003, Gray Davis replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Well, anyway, I believe there were 6 attempts to start the recall process here in right after Newsom was elected in 2018. Didn't go very well. The governor was doing very well, and his approval ratings during the pandemic was very popular. A lot of his choices were. Then things started getting a little rough for him because he started imposing some pretty tight restrictions on businesses. No outdoor dining for a stretch of time. During this period of heavy restrictions, restaurants were open, but the governor decided to go out to a very fancy dinner at one of Northern California's most well-known, famous, and most expensive restaurants, French Laundry. And he was dining there without a mask with a group of people from different households, and 2 of them happened to be lobbyists. And it was just a very ugly optical situation for him where he was sitting at a table in a very exclusive restaurant without a mask, not following any of the rules and guidelines. Meanwhile, a lot of businesses were losing their businesses. People were absolutely struggling, and they see this picture. And after that, it was off to the races. The gathering of the signatures, it started accelerating, and they were also, the organizers and the lead proponents were given a little bit more time because of the pandemic. And that makes sense to a lot of people, because if you think about it, normally you would go stand outside of a grocery store or a strip mall and be able to walk up to people and get signatures. Obviously, that was a lot more challenging during this time. So they were allowed more time to gather the signatures they needed, and they were able to do it, and actually gathered more than they needed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that whole practice what you preach thing. Momentary lapse in judgment, perhaps by the governor, but we'll see. By the way, while we've been sitting here, into my inbox comes some reporting from our colleagues, Major Garrett and his producer, Arden Farhi. Get this, Sean Clegg, who you guys know as a campaign advisor to the governor, says, quote, "There is no scenario where we lose tomorrow. We see the blue giant waking up. I don't see evidence of a red giant waking up in California."
Interesting. Bold.
And multiple Republican campaigns tell CBS News their private polling shows yes on recall or kick out the governor, losing by margins in the high single digits or low double digits. So, no scenario where they lose tomorrow. It's a pretty confident statement. They must be seeing something now here on recall eve that suggests they've got it in the bag. We'll see. Go ahead, Kenny.
Yeah, I was going to say, when Vice President Harris visited the Bay Area last week, when there was this meeting between with the reporters and Newsom's advisors, they seemed very confident when they were talking about the election cycle and how things are going. And then at one point, a reporter asked, "Are you declaring something right now?" And then they were quick to backtrack a little bit and say, "We're not declaring anything yet." But you could sense the confidence, especially with the recent polling and that shift that you saw just within a matter of weeks. The early polling indicated a very tight race for several months, and then you saw the sudden shift. And so you started hearing Newsom's advisors last week speaking very confidently. So, that news that you just broke, Ed, certainly is a great sign for the Newsom campaign. But we'll see if the polling is correct.
But as we said, the intrigue is also in how many people show up tomorrow in person. and how close can they get it potentially? Will it be a long night or an easy night for the governor? We'll see. Look, guys, we have. I've enjoyed this. I hope you did too. Hope the viewers did as well. But we should wrap things up. Bottom line, if you are in California or if you're not, you can watch this coverage tomorrow night on all three of the CBS-owned stations in California: KCBS, KCAL in LA, KOVR, CBS 13 in Sacramento, and of course the great KPIX 5 in San Francisco. Or on CBSN nationally, we'll be simulcasting coverage from California late into the night, East Coast, prime time in the West. And I understand at least one of your stations is going all the way, if necessary, into the morning. Maybe you'll draw straws on that.
I think Kenny, you volunteered for that, right?
Do I get that since I joined this conversation?
That might be it. There you go. Right. San Francisco's pulling the leg to the UPB. Thank you so much, guys, for doing this. This was great.
Thank you.
We'll have to do it again at some point. Tom Waite of KCBS, KCAL, Steve Large of KOVR, Kenny Choi of KPIX. I'm Ed O'Keefe, CBS News in Washington. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.